Good afternoon and welcome to today's NCARB Live. My name is Claire Hilton Martinez and I am a member of the Marketing and Communications team here at NCARB. And today I'm excited to have our staff experts here that are going to provide an overview of two upcoming changes to the ARE. So the first change that you are aware of is the switch for all code-related items on the ARE to reference the 2021 International Code Council ICC family of codes and related standards rather than the 2018 family. And then the second change that our experts are going to talk about is the retirement of QFIBs, that is quantitative fill-in-the-blank ARE questions. And then our experts are going to talk about why NCARB is choosing to retire them and how this will affect your testing experience. At this point, we're going to open up the session so you can answer any questions that you may have, and you can do that using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. So yeah, feel free to send any and all of your ARE questions, and we will answer them during the Q&A portion later in the webinar. So before we dive in, I would like to let our examination experts go ahead and introduce themselves. Michelle?
Great, thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Cohn, Assistant Vice President of Examination here at NCARB, and I'm glad to be here with all of you to talk about our upcoming changes to the exam. I've been with NCARB for over 9 years now, working on all aspects of exam development and delivery, and I'm also an architect licensed here in DC. So I've been through this process myself and happy to share just my thoughts on how I got through the process and hopefully help all of you also. John?
Thanks, Michelle. And hello, everyone. I'm John O'Hara, and I'm the content manager on the examinations team here at NCARB. I'm also a licensed architect, and my role is to work with the architects who volunteer their time with NCARB to write and review the questions on the ARE.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. We're so glad to have you. And everyone, if you can just please direct your attention to the presentation that Michelle and John are going to give, and then feel free to ask any questions that you have throughout the webinar using the Q&A tool, and we will flag them for the Q&A session. Thank you, Michelle and John.
Yeah. First off, thank you all for joining this afternoon. As mentioned, today we're going to go over the two new updates to the ARE and give you all a chance to ask any questions you might have about what's changing or the ARE in general. Those two updates we'll be talking about are moving to the 2021 family of ICC codes and the retirement of QFIBs from the ARE. First, let's talk about the code update. At the end of February, scheduled for the 27th, all 6 ARE divisions will now use the 2021 International Code Council family of codes. This is mostly relevant to the International Building Code, as that is the primary code used, but it also applies to the ICC model codes. This also means that any code with the which the International Building Code references will be updated too. That includes going to the 2017 A117.1 accessibility code, the latest versions of the NFPA fire and life safety codes, and any of the other standards or codes referenced in IBC Chapter 35. That does not mean, however, that candidates need to memorize all these latest versions. We will still provide exhibits from specific code references in both discrete and case study items, and all those exhibits are being updated to reflect this change. Really, the reason for this update is that as code and regulatory requirements for architecture evolve, we want to make sure that the ARE, what is assessing, remains relevant to current practice. Michelle will now share an update about the QFIBs, which I'm sure everybody is interested in hearing more. Michelle?
Great, thanks, John. So same date as what John mentioned earlier, late February, again scheduled for the 27th. QFIBs, or quantitative fill-in-the-blank items, will no longer appear on the ARE. So the quantitative fill-in-the-blank items, as some of you may be familiar with, is of course where you're asked a question, you typically need to calculate something using that built-in calculator, and then type your answer into the answer box. As we retire those QFIB questions, all of the other item types will still be used on the exam. Multiple choice, check all that apply, hotspot, and drag and place. And all of those item types may now include calculations. So we're not getting rid of the need to calculate something, as that is, of course, important in the practice of architecture. It's just that those calculation items will now be among those other 4 item types, mostly in that multiple choice, but you might see some calculations on other item types as well. Let's move to that next slide, John. And so again, why are we removing this? Again, it's similar to what John mentioned about the update to the ICC 2021 versions. With the QFIBs, it's similarly about aligning with current testing industry standards. So John and myself and other members of our examination department do keep up with the research and best practices coming out of the testing industry, other organizations that are delivering licensure exams similar to ours. And what research has shown is that other item types are just more effective in assessing what candidates know. And so we want to, again, keep up with that within our own exam to keep the ARE as effective as possible in helping you on your path to licensure. So what does this mean moving forward? So once again, QFIBs will be removed from the ARE. They will also be removed from practice exams. Exam content, however, is not changing. Format, the scoring of the item types, none of that is changing. So as I mentioned, you'll still see calculation items on the exam. It's just that those calculations will be, you'll see them in other item types, just not QFIBs. I did see a question just now in the Q&A about what happens if you already have an exam scheduled. You'll still go ahead and take your exam. This does not impact any appointments that are already scheduled. It also doesn't impact any appointments that have already passed. So any prior exam scores for an exam that did include QFIBs, that still remains valid. Nothing about that will change. If you have an exam scheduled between now and the end of February, still go ahead and take the exam. Know that you probably will encounter some QFIBs. If you already have an exam scheduled for starting the tail end of February and into March, know that you won't see QFIBs, but either way, those appointments are not going to be impacted by this change. So I think that that's all we have for a presentation. And I think we are ready to take some questions.
Awesome. So thank you, Michelle and John. And I hope for all of our ARE candidates that you feel a bit more informed already. And as a reminder, so this is the time where we are going to ask Michelle and John questions live. So feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat now, if you haven't already. Also, I think before we start, I just wanted to ask my question. If candidates don't remember anything else from this presentation, I think I would love to know, Michelle and then John, what is the #1 thing that you'd like them to remember?
Oh gosh. I mean, the thing that sticks out for me, and some of this is actually not even specific to the code change or the QFIB change. It's the end of the year. We're coming up almost, New Year's is coming up. And so for me personally, that's always kind of that moment to say, like, what do I want to do in 2024? So that's been top of mind for me. And I think I'd like to just pass that on to our candidates of just think about, like, what is your plan for testing in 2024? Is this, your New Year's resolution to make your way through, complete the ARE, or at least complete a few more divisions, and, make that plan, strategize how you're going to get there, and, add that to your goals for the coming year.
I think for me, it's, the reason we're doing this, it's a constant improvement. We're not doing this arbitrarily. We're looking at, the way the test is taken, our psychometricians, the data we're getting for that, making sure that it's aligned with best practice. And we're making these changes for a reason, and it is to, constantly improve the exam, making sure that it's staying relevant. And that's an important part of the work that we do.
Thank you both. Okay, so now we will officially go to questions that we have from webinar attendees. The first question that I would like to ask from a candidate, it says, Will NCARB supply an explanation of the changes from the 2018 codes to the 2021 codes?
Well, I can, I guess, take that one to start off here. I believe, Claire, we sent an ARE update last week, I think it was, or the week before. It's right around the time that we advertised this webinar, in fact, about the changes from the 2018 to the 2021 code. And I believe, as I recall, that ICC actually has a really great summary on their website with what those changes are. So Claire, I don't know if that's something that we can, share out with candidates again. But I think rather than NCARB putting that together, we really look to ICC. They write those code documents, and so they really have that best summary of what those changes are.
I would also add to that when you have a question that references code, we provide the information about the code that it's referencing. So those updates will also be included. It's not about memorizing specific passages of code. So if anything was updated in the new version, those updates will also be shown in the exhibits or whatever the question is referencing for that.
Thank you both. The next question we have is, when will QFIBs be removed from the practice exams?
I can take that one. It will be removed the same date that the live exams are released. So the 27th is what we are scheduled for both of those. So on the 27th, the practice exam will also have the QFIBs removed and the updated code information. February 27th.
Thank you. Our next question from a candidate is, what drove NCARB to migrate from the 2018 code to the 2021 code?
Well, I think John alluded to this a little bit earlier about continuous improvement, and I can build out on that a bit more. Certainly keeping the exam relevant to current practice, that's always a goal of ours. And we know that different jurisdictions have different timeframes for adopting codes. I actually just spoke to some folks last week in one of our jurisdictions who said, but our jurisdiction isn't even going to adopt the 2021 code. We're going to stick with 2018, and we'll go to 2024 down the road, right? And so I know that different jurisdictions have different code adoption cycles, and I know candidates often have questions about, well, how am I supposed to study for this version if my jurisdiction uses a different version? What NCARB's philosophy has always been, and we do this every few years with the exam, we want to keep the exam relevant for just best practice within codes, knowing that we're never going to hit one code document that every jurisdiction is using. But what I'd like to emphasize for everyone is you're not asked to memorize any particular version of the code or any code excerpts. As John mentioned, if you need to use a piece of code to answer a question, we'll provide that to you in the exam. You're not meant to memorize it. So really what you want to focus on is how to use a code document and how to apply that code to a specific scenario. So it's similar to, you might be used to using the zoning code in your jurisdiction, and then you start working on a project elsewhere with a different zoning code. Well, that might be a new code for you, but you know how to apply it to your project. So it's the same thing here. It might be a code, the 2021 code might not be familiar to you, but it's really about just understanding how to apply the code to a new situation.
Thank you, Michelle. Our next question is, can you share an example of a calculation question and how it might be different after this change?
Yeah, sure. I think, there's a lot of different examples. A lot of them in programming and analysis dealing with, figuring out square footages for FAR requirements. And, you have to multiply length by area and take out setbacks and that sort of thing to figure out like footprints. So, without getting into a specific numerical example, those will still exist. It might be a multiple choice question instead. So, rather than having to type in the numerical answer, you'll be given 4 to 3 numerical responses that are the correct answer. It could be a check all that apply that requires some form of calculation in the item, and then you have to determine something based on the result of that calculation. So it's just part of architecture. Calculation is required. We're just not going to require the answer be a written form, numerical response, open-ended.
Thank you, John. My next question is something we're just seeing in the Q&A is it seems like people are needing a bit more clarification on exactly what a QFIB is. So would one of you like to just kind of go back and explain exactly what that is and how folks can identify it?
Sure. So QFIB, again, stands for Quantitative Fill-in-the-Blank. And so for those of you who have already tested, or if you've taken one of the practice exams, you'll recognize QFIBs by those are the questions that have an answer box where you have to type something in. Whenever we've had those types of items, the thing you're typing in is a number. So that's the quantitative part of that description. And you're literally filling in that blank with what is the correct answer. And it, like to John's point, maybe it's about calculating a setback in a programming analysis question, or maybe it's about calculating plumbing fixture counts in, a PPD question, and, might have to do with egress widths, for instance. Maybe that's a thing you're calculating, stairs, ramp lengths, anything like that, where you're calculating and the answer is a number. That's going to be a QFIB item type. So if you'd like to see what those are like, and you haven't yet experienced them, they still exist in the practice exam. But again, those item types are what's going to be going away. You'll still need to calculate stuff. And that's what John was getting at in his earlier response. You're still going to need to calculate things because architects have to calculate things just as part of regular practice in typical projects. So just instead of needing to type something in, that kind of fill in the blank part of it, instead you'll receive several different options, say in a multiple choice, you'll see several different options. Is it 12 toilets, 13, 14, or 15? And you'll be selecting the correct answer as opposed to having to type in the correct answer. And so just a reminder for everyone, again, is that there's a calculator built into the exam delivery software. And so you'll be able to use that as you're answering any calculation item. The calculator has a history function built into it, so it can be really helpful if you have multiple calculations in a row to get to the final answer. And so I encourage everyone to try out the practice exam. Even if you see a QFIB item right now in the practice exam, still go ahead and attempt those, because it's a good chance to just try out the calculation kind of aspect of it and really get used to using that calculator.
Thank you, Michelle. Another question. So when do these changes go into effect again? And for example, if a candidate has an exam already scheduled for March, will they be affected by these updates?
Yeah, so the 27th of February is when it's scheduled to go live. So if you take your exam before then, you'll still see QFIBs. If you take your exam after that date or on or after that date, you will see no more QFIBs on the exam. So if your exam is scheduled for March, then the version that you see in March will not have QFIBs on it. So that's going to be the only impact. As Michelle mentioned previously, the content and what we're testing on the exam is not changing. Really, the only thing you'll notice is that you didn't see any answers that required you to fill in a numerical response. There'll be other item types instead, but basically all of the content, everything that we're testing on is remaining the same.
Thank you, John. Another candidate asked, do you expect the passing scores to improve after the removal of QFIBs? Or do you imagine this will change or impact the cut score?
Well, there will be no impact to the cut score. That will stay the same, because as John mentioned, the content is staying the same. And so there will not be any impact to the cut score. I remember that a passing score is really a snapshot in a moment, in that moment of how many candidates passed in a period of time versus failed. I don't know if that will change. I'm not going to venture a guess on that. Again, we're making this change because we've been studying, well, we study statistics on our exam on a regular basis. And we have been looking at QFIBs in particular for some time now, and just recognizing that they are just less effective as an item type. And we're not making this change because we want to impact pass rates. We're making this change because we want to just make the exam a more effective measurement tool as part of the overall path to licensure.
Thank you, Michelle. Another question is, will there be new study materials released to coincide with the updated 2021 IBC family? So aside from the practice exams, and they gave the example of updated AIA contract documents.
So what we will be releasing is in a few months an updated ARE guidelines, which will reflect these changes, along with, you know, making sure that the references that we're noting in those guidelines are reflective of, you know, what the new IBC ICC standards are for 2021. I'm assuming that's the question that's being asked, but we will be providing that as part of the ARE guideline updates that will coincide with this around the same time.
I also heard there was a question about contracts, I think, kind of as part of this. It's like a multi-question there. There is no change to AIA contracts. So the I believe it's the 2017 roughly family of contracts that we're currently testing on. AIA has not updated their contracts, so we're not updating anything on our end. So no changes to contracts. Whatever is listed in the current ARE guidelines, that's what you'll see when we re-release the ARE guidelines as far as contracts go. Again, down the road, if AIA does release new versions of those commonly used contracts, then we'll let everyone know. But for now, no changes to contracts.
Thank you both. Another candidate asked, so y'all have mentioned the update to ANSI A117 in the reference codes in IBC 2021, but it diverges fairly significantly from the 2010 ADA. Will questions generally clue the tester in to which reference should be used for which accessibility related question?
Yes. So when we are testing on especially a specific reference such as that, not necessarily IBC, we'll provide the exhibit saying if it is the ADA standards or A117.1, and that exhibit will reflect the newer version. So yes, any question that references these, it will be clear that, you know, it's not ambiguous as to which accessible standard is supposed to be used. We will say if it is A117.1, and we'll say the version year 2017. So yeah, we will make sure that that is included in the questions that reference those specific code sections.
Thank you, John. Our next question is, which division will be affected the most?
Oh, wow, that's a wild question there. I mean, we have not been looking at that impact per division. But John, I think you probably actually have more detail on this one.
Yeah, no, I think we haven't looked specifically at how many questions have been updated per division. We've just been making sure that they're updated. If any change impacts the answer being right or wrong, that's also updated. But in general, if you look at the ARE guidelines and you look at our sections and objectives and the breakdowns there, you're going to find the sections that are most heavily related to code updates. So those are going to probably be PPD, PDD divisions, as you know, those have specific objectives in them that are related to IBC and comparing IBC to other codes and standards. I think you'll see a lot less of that in the PCM and PJM. The exact kind of magnitude, I couldn't say offhand, but yeah, look at the objectives and the sections, and that's going to give you a kind of insight as to where we have most code-related questions.
Thank you both. Our next question is, how will rounding be dealt with in calculations going forward?
Well, so I know this was a question that candidates often had with QFIBs. And I think that's, when we talk about QFIBs being a little less effective, I think that's, this is part of it, is that candidates often had questions about, do I round it to the nearest whole number? Do I round it to the hundredths? Do I need to put in 0.0 if the answer is a whole number? And so, this is one way that hopefully this is no longer a point of confusion for candidates. So when let's say we're talking about a multiple choice question and the answer includes a decimal, when we provide those response options, as part of that multiple choice, we'll include the right amount of decimals to answer that question. So I'd like to say that that's no longer something that candidates will need to focus on, as they're trying to answer the question, do that calculation. If the answer that you get when you do your calculation is one of those responses that's provided to you in the item, then, you got it, right? You solve that problem. You now have an obvious option to select to answer the problem. And so the number of decimals, again, it's no longer something that you would need to try to sort out for yourself. It's whatever those options are, that are provided to you would be out to the right number of decimals, in that sort of instance.
Thank you, Michelle. Another candidate has asked if NCARB can update the practice exams prior to the change so that candidates who are testing soon after February 27th can practice with updated questions. Can one of you speak to this?
So with the way that we assemble the forms and release them, we have to set a date and make them go live, working with our test providers. Because when you take the practice exam, it's read as administrating exam. So we are kind of stuck with that February 27th date, just based on having all this roll out consistently at the same time.
I'd suggest, I was going to suggest to candidates, if you are testing, soon after, and, you are concerned about that, just know that if you're taking the practice exam and you see a QFIB, just know that, well, you just won't see that item type when you take your actual exam. So you can certainly skip over it. Or like I said earlier, you could still go ahead and answer it just to get that, continued practice about that particular content. And again, really get familiar with how the calculator that's built into the software works, with the history, history feature that's in that calculator, and just, get used to the particular content that's being assessed, regardless of the item type itself. Because again, this change that we've been talking about, it's about the item type. It's not about the content. The content is still going to be assessed on the exam.
Thank you both. Our next question is there any designated proportion of question types? So like a percentage for QFIBs or drag and drop, etc.
So yes, we build our test on certain test specification standards, dealing with the objectives that are covered in the exam, and we share that information in the ARI guidelines. So what percentage you can expect to see of certain sections and how many questions you might see of each objective in that section. And then baked into all of that is the types of questions and the number of different types of questions. So multiple choice, kata, the drag and place, or the hotspot. All of those are built around test specification to make sure that we're covering content holistically. So the exact breakdown is kind of the confidential test specification that the board has approved. We share kind of ranges within the ARI guidelines that will give you a sense of like what you can expect in terms of the number and types of questions for each objective and section though.
Thank you, John. Our next question is, will the removal of QFIB questions result in new questions on both the actual and practice exams?
So like we mentioned, the content is not changing. And because QFIBs cover some important content, those the calculations that are typical of architectural practice. Many of those QFIBs have been repurposed as other item types. So you'll often see them now as multiple choice is, most likely, as far as kind of seeing some of that same material just in a different way. So that's something that candidates can keep an eye out for. Again, they'll still see that same content. They'll still need to perform calculations. But yeah, you'll see more than likely those will be as multiple choice items. So what's going to end up happening is instead of the QFIBs, you'll just kind of see more of everything else. So the number of items on your exam is not going to change. That total number of items that's being delivered to you, that will stay the same. So kind of the spots that the QFIBs took up on the exam will be just replaced by other item types.
Thank you, Michelle. Our next question is, should candidates expect that some response options will be the wrong answer, but with the only difference from the correct answer being a decimal place?
I'll answer that one. No. Specifically, we're not trying to test candidates if they know how to round properly. So there won't be any that are just intentionally trying to trick or mislead the candidate. For instance, if the calculated value that you get is 0.49999, you're not going to get an answer that's 0.49 or 0.5. And then it's up to you to determine how to round that. That's not going to be it. Basically, if you have to answer the question with a numerical value, the distractors are going to be things that are reasonable. Maybe there was a calculation step that was missed or something that was interpreted incorrectly, but not so close as to be kind of tricking the candidate to thinking, oh yeah, I have to figure out how to round this, or if I have too many decimal places, it might be something else. They won't be that close.
Thank you, John. Another question from a candidate is about the calculator. So there's a few questions about this actually in the Q&A and about commas on the calculator. Folks are wondering why there aren't commas on the calculator in the exam and if NCARB could add commas.
I think that's a great question that we can certainly work with our vendor partners on developing. I know some calculators have commas, some calculators don't. It happens that the one that's built into our delivery software doesn't have a comma, but I appreciate that input from candidates. And we work really closely with all of our vendor partners who help us develop and deliver the exam. And so that's certainly something we can take back to see about, adding that feature to the calculator. And so I'll just, remind candidates that if you see something and you think, gosh, this could really be improved if only NCARB would do this, like, we have a great customer service team here at NCARB, and you can certainly reach out and, and share that feedback with us.
Thank you, Michelle. So another question is about the code changes. So since IBC 2021 is an update to IBC 2018, the code structure and content is largely the same, and the ARE is updating code questions to conform with those updates. So what this candidate is saying is that they would expect many code-related questions didn't change, but could either of you speak to what percentage of code-related questions were revised?
The exact percentage I couldn't say, but I would, what that candidate's thinking is true. It's not going to be a high percentage. Like they said, there's a lot that has remained the same, and it's still, the same content. So there wasn't an update that needed to be made. As Michelle mentioned previously, I think if you go to the ICC and see like the types of where they talk about what has changed between 2018 and 2021, you'll get a sense of the types of questions, and those would be the ones that we've changed. But again, it isn't a very high percentage. There's some critical changes that I think have happened, but for the most part, a lot of it has stayed consistent.
Thank you, John. So is there any more information that candidates can get on specific sections, tables, etc., for questions that are referencing 2018 versus 2021 IBC?
I'm not sure if that question is about kind of from the ICC angle, like what aspects of the code have changed from 2018 to 2021. Like I mentioned, ICC is certainly the best source of what those changes are. I know we had shared that via email, via previous NCARB update that went out to all of our candidates, but hopefully our marketing team can share that out with everyone again, as far as that great resource that ICC has put together. And as far as on the exam, like John was just mentioning, a lot of our content, the particulars of a lot of our items didn't change because a lot of pieces of the code didn't change, in that 2018 to 2021 update. So, and as with any code change, sometimes a change is actually quite small. Maybe just, a table got updated, instead of table 10.3, maybe now it's table 10.4. So I'm not trying to, say that all changes are really tiny, but I will say that a lot of those changes did not have a strong impact on our exam. And remember, as you're preparing for the exam, the focus is really on whatever code excerpt is provided to you within an item. It's about being able to apply that particular code to whatever the scenario is, and not necessarily having memorized that section of the code.
Thank you, Michelle. Another question is about passing scores, the end of exam pass or fail prediction. People want to know how accurate is that prediction? How much stock should they put into that?
So, I mean, that prediction is accurate. We score the exam at the end of the exam. If it says you likely pass, you have likely passed. We put that there to make sure that there was no testing anomalies that we have to account for. It's really for security reasons. When you pass the exam, if there were certain flags that might have, maybe made it look like there might have been something that was related to cheating going on, that might happen. But for the most part, we just put that there to make sure, if you likely passed, you have. We just set it there to make sure that we have a chance to look at the exam for any testing anomalies.
Thank you, John. Another question is about something that maybe NCARB could do after this webinar before the change goes into effect. Someone is asking if we could provide a side-by-side example of how the same question would be asked as a QFIB versus as a different item type.
Yeah, I'm sure that we could put an example together. And then again, Claire, we'll be asking your marketing, you and the marketing team to help us share that externally with candidates, but certainly we could share out kind of a before and after for, say an item in our practice exam.
Thank you, Michelle. So I know earlier we had a question about the exam tools, the calculator, and we've also gotten several questions about the whiteboard versus scratch paper. Can one of you go over what was the impetus for NCARB changing from scratch paper to the whiteboard, and if we would ever consider changing back?
Sure, I can take a stab at it. Michelle, you can chime in if you would like. Really, it's about twofold. Exam and testing best practices and a clean desk policy being better for testing, but also because to make the test fair between both in-person and virtual administrations, we had to have a consistent way of being able to provide the space to jot down notes for both types of administration. So it goes back to testing industry best practices and exam security.
Yeah, I think you've certainly covered the highlights on that, John. I know some folks might remember that change from the scratch paper to the digital whiteboard was made when we launched online proctoring. But we would have gone there anyway, even if we hadn't launched online proctoring. Again, to your point, John, about just best practices in the testing industry, certainly from a security standpoint, and now with a fairness standpoint as well, with the different delivery modalities. We do not plan to go back to scratch paper. So I'll just, again, recommend everyone, spend that time in the practice exam, get used to the whiteboard. Since we've been talking so much about calculations, I will just also remind everyone that when you're using that whiteboard, there is a text feature. I know some candidates get frustrated at using the mouse to try to write numbers. Yeah, I would find that really frustrating as well, but there is actually a text tool built into the whiteboard. So if you do need to jot down some notes about calculations or whatever it is in the particular item that you're working on, use that text feature. You can type right into that whiteboard, and hopefully, again, use that as you're solving the items.
Yeah, and if you're unsure about how it works, definitely use the practice exam. You can try it out there, get familiar with it, become a little bit more comfortable with it before actually taking the exam, especially if you haven't used it yet. Definitely go to the practice exam, get a feel for it. That way, when you're actually taking the exam, you're a little bit more comfortable with it.
Thank you both. So you're confirming that there will still be calculation questions, but the answer choices will be different. So like the way a candidate would select the answer is going to be different. It could be, multiple choice or something of that nature, just not fill in the blank.
Confirmed. If you have an item that requires calculation, the answer might be a multiple choice that is a number, or in order to select the correct answer in a multiple choice or kata, or even a hotspot or dragon place, you'll still have to do a calculation to get that correct answer, even if that answer isn't a number. You'll see that when we update the practice exam, a lot of them ended up being multiple choice, as Michelle mentioned, where rather than just having to type in the number, you are selecting from multiple choice options that are numbers. But there are still exam items that require calculation where the answer isn't necessarily a number, but you do need that number to get to the correct answer. So.
Thank you. Another question from a candidate is asking if either of you see more amendments like this happening before ARE 5.0 is retired.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, the question came up earlier about contracts. AIA typically is on about a 10-year horizon for updating contracts. So certainly if there are any contract updates during the lifespan of 5.0, then we would want to be updating those down the road. IBC, similarly, they're on a 3-year cycle. So if we need to update code again before 5.0 ends, then we will. I think, and probably the follow-on question, Claire, is going to be, so what is the horizon for 5.0? I mean, this is something that NCARB is actively looking at. John and I were just at kind of a mega committee meeting recently of multiple NCARB committees that were focusing on policy and future planning. And so we do have some task forces that are looking at our future licensure process. And that's the earliest. I'd say ARE 6.0 is still 5 years away. So there is still a long lifespan of ARE 5.0. So our current exam is still going to be around for a while. And so kind of back to my point at the very beginning about set your goals for 2024. Don't sit this out and think like, oh my gosh, NCARB is making changes. I'm just going to wait till it settles down again. Like, get in there and test. These changes, again, it's just part of continuous improvement. We've actually been through this before in terms of, updating code. It's about every 3 years, just like IBC is every 3 years. And so I'd encourage everyone to just keep going with your testing plan and not get discouraged by, this change that's happening.
Thank you, Michelle. Our next question is, would it be fair to say that the change in QFIB questions should result in a better test-taking experience for the user?
would say, I mean, again, we're going back to the reason we're doing this, aligning with test industry best practices. I see a lot of comments from the community, concerns and questions about like, do I need to commas or do I need to add how many decimal spots do I need? And I think, getting rid of that confusion and that concern will definitely improve the test taking experience. But overall, the reason we're doing this is that, other item types assess the same content better. So from that aspect, we're improving the exam. So, there may not be a huge, oh yes, this feels so much better as a test taker. But I do think that, in general, it's going to feel, it's going to feel a little bit easier in terms of just, I think there's a little bit of concern about, oh, I typed in this number. I have to then double check my math and make sure that number that I typed in is right. There's less of that time taken, concerned about the kind of technical aspects of typing in a number versus selecting the multiple choice response or one of the other item types.
Now we have another question about the exam tools. So we've seen a couple of questions asking if the whiteboard can be updated so that it doesn't erase your notes after you close it.
Yeah, again, appreciate the question there. That is certainly something that we can take back again to work with our vendor partners on. And my recollection is that the whiteboard shouldn't be erasing your notes. It looks like John is agreeing with me there. So I would say this is sort of my, by the way, if you do experience something in the test center that feels like a technical glitch or something feels a little bit wonky, that is another great reason to reach out to our customer service team and just report that, hey, something happened in my testing experience that I don't think was quite right. I think that there was a technical glitch, with the delivery software, and, and that helps our team, be able to investigate what happened, see if that had any impact on, your, how that might have impacted your experience, and, work with our partners as needed to try to, fix any glitches, address that situation moving forward.
And a reminder that if you experience technical difficulties, you should reach out and explain your experience in writing. You can go to ncarb.org/contact and fill out a contact form that will go to one of our customer relations team members. And you should do that within 14 days of your test date.
Yeah, that's an important point, Claire. I was actually just going to add that actually inside our ARE guidelines, there is actually in the table of contents a section on what happens if I have a problem at the test center. So really important to read that section even before you go to the test center, just to, arm yourself with that information. Most of our candidates have completely uneventful testing experiences. But on the rare occasion that something does happen, we do have that avenue for you to report that issue. But again, just make sure you read that information in the ARE guidelines, because it does outline the steps that you as a candidate need to take, including, the time frame for when you need to report something.
Also, I love seeing in the Q&A different folks responding to each other. Someone said that the trick to the whiteboard is that you have to click out of the text box so that it doesn't erase what you typed, and that if you don't do that, your input is lost, but that this same experience is reflected on the practice exam as well. So that's just a note for everyone to remember. Another candidate also recommended just closing the whiteboard before hitting next. So, yeah. Another question that we have is, can NCARB provide a tutorial of how to use the whiteboard and the calculator?
I've been here a year, and I know that we've gone over that in the past when we first rolled it out, but I think that would be great. I think that's something that we could probably put together and show a video of just how to use that, if that's not something we already have, Michelle.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we can add to our to-do list. Again, is providing that additional resource for our candidates. I know we do have a number of helpful videos on NCARB's YouTube channel, or those are available, again, through our website. And so I love hearing the tips that candidates are sharing with each other. So I'll put in a plug here for our ARE community, which I know is another great place where candidates often share those kind of best practices with each other, and those helpful tips and tricks, in addition to asking questions to NCARB. And I know, John, you're frequently on that community answering those questions for candidates.
Thank you, Michelle. We're about to start wrapping up our Q&A, but I may ask just one or two more questions. So once the practice exams are updated in February, will candidates need to re-add the practice exams for the content to be updated, or will it automatically be updated whenever they access it?
I think we're talking about, so inside the practice exam dashboard, when you click on that link through your NCARB record, you end up on that dashboard where you purchase a free exam. So if you've already purchased your free practice exam, if you take that after February 27th, it will reflect the current content that's on the practice exam. So even if you had purchased it before February 27th, if it's just sitting there and then you access it after the 27th, you'll see the QFIB free version of that practice exam, because it just pulls from kind of the current content on the practice exam.
Thank you, Michelle. Another question about the practice exams is, how often are they revised? So how often?
So there's kind of two parts to that. One, because the questions on the practice exam were never pre-tested, they are the first time that they're seeing them. If candidates or community members identify something that may not be right with the question, we revise those and make regular kind of maintenance updates based on feedback from our volunteer item writers. If there's something identified in the practice exam on a specific question that may be incorrect or not 100% correct. And we've also been charged this year with expanding our practice exam as part of one of our objectives for next year. So we are looking to expand the number of offerings of practice exams in the future. Takes a lot of new items to be able to write those practice exams, but it is something that we are working on developing for the coming work year.
Awesome. Well, thank you, John, and thank you both for answering all of these questions from our candidates. I think at this point, I would just love to know if you had any additional takeaways or kind of a top line summary of your content from today's webinar.
I'll just put in my plug again for, planning ahead. I know that sometimes it can feel like a long process to get to licensure. I went through this, John went through this, we came out the other side. For me, when I was a candidate, what really worked was creating that plan and just knowing that I need about this much time to study for each exam. And so I set my exam date and I just cleared my calendar and focused on studying, and wow, it felt great to kind of get to the end of that process. So, kind of now is a good time of year to just set out those goals for 2024, create, what is your testing strategy going to be?
And I think, going back to, this may feel like a big update, the code changes and, going to the new versions of the model codes, as well as removing QFIBs. But I do want to reiterate that the impact you'll feel when you're taking the exam is going to be minimal. It's going to be the same content. It's going to be the same kind of base assessment that we're trying to do, same objectives. And for those code changes, we're providing the kind of information that's needed to reference them. We're not requiring you to memorize what has changed between 2018 and 2021. It may help you to be familiar with those changes so that you're not operating on assumptions that you had about 2018, but we're going to be providing all the information needed based on those updates, and then all of the kind of calculations and other items that we have in the exam are just going to be in a different format.
Thank you both. And I lastly just want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you couldn't see the entire webinar, if you couldn't join us for the whole thing, or if you would like to reference anything at a later date, don't forget that the recording will be available on our YouTube channel, and we will be emailing you shortly with this recording. But if you have any questions in the meantime, like we've said, don't hesitate to reach out to our customer relations team. They're truly great, and they are here to help you with whatever you need. And you can do that by going to ncarb.org/contact and filling out a contact form there. Also, don't forget to keep up with us on all of our social media channels at NCARB. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok as well. So yes, thank you again. We're so glad you were able to join us, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you, John and Michelle.